So we're going to get into today something called completing the square. We're going to talk about this today and tomorrow. This is another method that we can use when it comes to solving square, like quadratic equations. So in the past we did a lot with graphing and with factoring. This whole chapter is about the different ways that you guys can work with quadratics. So at the very start, I said we're going to be in this chapter for a while because there's a lot of different methods that we can use. One of the next ones that we're going to go over is something called completing the square. What we're going to do today is kind of just an introduction to what happens if you're trying to find the roots or the zeros of something that is squared. So like before, when we were graphing and when we were factoring, we were looking for our answers, and you guys had some situations where you had to factor it and it would say like x plus 2, x minus 3. And then you set each of those equal to 0 and you got two different numbers for your x. You would have gotten like -2 and +3 for that situation. So when we're getting into these quadratics, because there's that x squared piece involved, that's going to tell you that there's two solutions out there, two possible solutions out there. So we're going to talk about something today called the square root property. And so what it says is that if you've got something like x squared equals 9, in order to solve both sides, then you can actually just square root both sides. You can square root the x squared and you can square root the 9. Now when you square root x squared, it's similar to if like you square root a 4 or a 9 or a 16, like a perfect square number. You just get an x to come out. Okay, so the square root of x squared becomes x. And the square root of 9, notice how they put this plus minus sign in front of it. So the square root of 9 is going to be plus or minus 3, because you could have +3 times +3 and get 9. Or you could have had -3 times -3 and gotten 9. So we have to put a plus minus sign in front of these answers when we're square rooting, because there's a positive and there's a negative answer out there. And that's the two numbers that would satisfy the x squared. Remember, I said the square tells you that there should probably be two answers out there most of the time. There are some odd situations when there's only one number, so like you get the same thing twice. And then we'll also later on start talking about what happens if there's not real numbers, if we have to start dealing with the complex answers. So we're going to practice today using the square root property and solving problems with that. So we're going to start with another one that's similar to that first one with that x squared equals 9. So we have x squared equals 25. So before, like you guys would move the 25 over and set it equal to 0 and then try to factor it, we're not going to do that for this one. We're just going to go ahead and square root both sides. So the square root of x squared would just be x. For the 25 now, make sure you put a plus minus sign down first. What is the square root of 25? 5. So x would be equal to plus or minus 5. Now if we get into those numbers that aren't perfect squares, so we talked about this at the beginning of the school year, where sometimes you have numbers that can't like be put underneath the square root and get a nice whole number to come out, like we'd get decimals or something like that. So on this case, for the second one, x squared equals 15. If I square root both sides, the square root of x squared is still going to be x. I'm still going to need a plus minus sign in front. But 15 is not a perfect square number. And if I think about those perfect square numbers, so 4, 9, 16, 25, 36, and so on, we talked about those at the beginning of the year. None of these go into 15. 4 doesn't go into 15 nicely. 9 doesn't go into 15 nicely. 16 is too big. So if you can't square root it, you just leave it underneath that radical sign. So the answer then, like if I actually square root 15, I'll get some decimal. It'll probably be like 4 point something. What you're going to have then is just like that decimal answer, but there would be a positive side and there would be a negative side to it. Now in number 3, x squared equals 40. We start doing the same thing. We square root both sides. So the square root of x squared is just an x. Now the square root of 40, put your plus minus sign. Think about that list that I had written up here. So if we come up here for a second, think about these numbers right here. Is there one of those that can go into 40? 4. 4 times what? 10. So I'm going to rewrite 40 as 4 times 10. So now we have x equals plus or minus. You can split these apart, so it's the square root of 4 times the square root of 10. You can only square root one of them, though. Which one is it? 4, and what is the square root of 4? 2. So this is going to become x equals plus or minus. The square root of 4 becomes a 2, so that comes out of the square root sign. The 10, 4 can't go into 10, and 9 can't go into 10, so we have to leave 10 underneath the square root sign. So this is that simplifying radicals, and like I said, we did do this at the very start of the year when we did some review. We talked about square roots and simplifying those, but that was back in August when we were doing that. So you would just leave your answer right here. For number 4, they've changed it again just a little bit. Instead of it just saying n squared, they've put a 3 in front of it. So what I would do first is, if you can, try to get rid of that number in front of the term that's squared, in front of your letter. So I see 3 and I see 36. I'm going to go ahead and try to divide both sides by 3. And I would only do this if it's going to come out somewhat nicely here. So over on the left side, you just have n squared left. Equals, what is 36 divided by 3? 12. So we have n squared equals 12. Now we're going to square root both sides. So the square root of n squared is just an n, equals plus or minus. Let's talk about that 12. Again, think about that list of numbers, 4, 9, 16, 25, 36, and so on. Which number can go into 12? 4. So we're going to rewrite 12 as 4 times 3. So then you could have it as plus or minus the square root of 4 times the square root of 3. You don't necessarily have to separate them like that. I'm just doing that so you guys can see, like, you can either combine things or you can separate them out underneath the square root like that, and then you can just square root the ones that are easily done. So in this case, the square root of 4 is 2 again. So we get plus or minus 2, and then that radical 3 just has to attach on to the end. Okay, for number 5, we have 4x squared minus 20 equals 5. I would try, again, like we've seen these problems, you've always had like the x squared term by itself and then everything on the other side of the equal sign. So we're trying to solve for that x squared. So it's like what you guys would have done when you're solving just a regular equation for x. You're trying to get that x term alone. So the first thing I'm going to do here is add 20. So now I have 4x squared. 5 plus 20 is going to be 25. Then, like we had to do on the last one, I'm going to divide both sides by 4. So now I have x squared equals 25 over 4. I'm going to leave it as a fraction. And the reason why I'm going to leave it here is because what I'm going to do next is what we've been doing on all those other problems, square root both sides. And I'm going to square root that entire fraction. Just like we did with multiplying, like when I was taking that 12 in the last problem and I broke it down to 4 times 3. And then I separated it, so it was the square root of 4 times the square root of 3. I can separate a division problem too. So I can say x squared equals the square root of 25 over the square root of 4. I can break it apart. So what is the square root of 25 again? 5. So I'm going to do x equals, because now I'm going to square root both sides. So I'm going to do x equals plus or minus 5. And what's the square root of 4? 2. So my answer is going to be 5 over 2. All right, so why don't you guys try number 6. Move terms away from the x squared term. Try to solve it. So the first thing I would have done is added 3. So now it says 2x squared equals what? Good, 18. Then what would you guys have done? Divided by 2. So now it says x squared equals 9. The last step is to do what? Square root. So what's the square root of 9? 3. So make sure you wrote x equals plus minus 3. Okay, for these last couple, they've got, instead of just x squared or n squared or whatever the letter is, they have in parentheses x plus or minus a number. And that whole quantity now is squared. We are still going to solve this exactly like we would have solved it on the other side. Instead of it just being x squared, it just says x plus 2 squared. So what that really means is you have x plus 2 and another x plus 2. Just like x squared was x times x. So I can still do my square roots on both sides. What happens on the left side here when I square root, like before when we square root x squared, we just wrote down x. All you're going to write down is the stuff that's inside the parentheses. The square root sign and that squared basically undo each other. They like cancel each other out. So whatever is left just pops down and you get rid of the square root sign and you get rid of the squared. So I'm just going to bring down x plus 2. Bring down the equal sign. Now the square root of 9 would be 3 and we have to do plus minus 3. So I still have that plus 2 attached to my x, so I need to subtract 2 from both sides. So here's what's happening now, because I have that plus minus 3. To solve for x, you're going to have to do 2 things. You're going to have to take positive 3 and subtract 2. And then you're going to have to take negative 3 and subtract 2. So you're still going to get 2 answers here because you have to subtract 2 different times. So 3 minus 2 would be 1. So there's one of your answers. Negative 3 minus 2 would be negative 5. So there's the other answer. For number 8, what do you guys think would be the first thing I would want to get rid of here? The 2. And how am I going to get rid of it? I don't want to distribute because this thing is squared. Instead, I want to divide. It's going to be easier if you just divide it. So I'm going to divide both sides by 2. So now I have over here x minus 5. That whole thing is still squared. 98 divided by 2 is 49. Okay, why don't you guys try to finish it out? So the first thing you should have done is square root both sides. So on the left side you should just have x minus 5. What's the square root of 49? 7. So make sure you guys wrote plus minus 7. Then what did you have to do here? Add 5. So plus 5 onto both sides. So again, you're going to have two different answers. For one of them, you're going to have to do the positive 7 plus 5. For the other one, you have to do negative 7 plus 5. So you should have gotten 12 and then negative 2. All right, last one on this page. We have x plus 6 squared equals 28. So again, I don't really have to move anything this time. I don't have to like divide by number because there's no number sitting in front of the parentheses. So I'm going to go ahead and just square root both sides. So on the left side I have x plus 6. And now I have plus or minus the square root of 28. Before I move that 6, let's see if we can simplify the square root of 28 at all. So think about your list of perfect squares. 4, 9, 16, 25, 36, and so on. Which number can go into 28? Divided. 25 can't divide. So is it 4, 9, 16, 4 times 7. So I'm going to rewrite this as 4 times 7 underneath there. So then it says x plus 6 equals plus or minus. The square root of 4 is going to be a 2. So a 2 comes out. The 7 has to stay underneath the square root sign. So because I have this simplified radical over here on the right side, to get x alone, like you guys would have done earlier, you would subtract your 6. So now it says x. And what you're going to want to do on the right side is not try to actually like do the math there. You're just going to write out the statement. So it's just going to say negative 6 plus or minus 2 square root of 7. And you guys can leave that answer there. That is the exact answer. If I actually did this, if I did 2 radical 7, I'm going to get a weird decimal. And then I have to add it and subtract it with that negative 6. So you would get decimal answers, which isn't wrong either. But it's easier if you guys just leave it here. You don't have to give me those decimals.